Liverpool Pierhead, the Crown Post Office on Victoria Street. A Tuesday morning in April 1934. Alfred Tunstall. We will use this name for a documented type of poste restante clerk, drawn from Crown Post Office staffing records, rather than a single named individual. Had worked the same counter for 9 years. And he had the bundle down from the alphabet rack before the man at the grill had finished giving his name. R for Rourke. 6 letters. The earliest postmarked the previous November. Thomas Rourke, again a documented composite, built from the recorded pattern of Liverpool registered merchant seamen of the period, had been at sea for 5 months. Liverpool out to Alexandria, on to Port Said, through the canal to Colombo and Singapore, and back the same way. He had written to his wife from every port where the ship lay long enough to find a postbox, and he had told her, before he sailed, which ports to try and return. Not knowing which of them the voyage would actually touch in time to matter, he did not know, standing at the counter with salt still stiff in the seams of his coat, whether all 6 letters answered what he had written, or only some of them, or whether Tunstall's ledger had sorted them in an order that meant anything at all. He knew only this: the grill, the alphabet rack, and Tunstall's particular way of checking a surname against a column of pencil marks were the first fixed point his voyage had touched in 5 months. Everything else, the ship's schedule, the weather off the Cape, the length of the queue at Port Said for a stamp that may or may not have been the right denomination, had been provisional. This counter was not. He did not know what was in the letters. That was the part the counter could not tell him. Poste restante was the mechanism built for exactly this uncertainty. Mail addressed to a named person with no fixed address, held at a post office until collected, released only on production of identification. For a merchant sailor, it was the only postal service designed around the fact that he did not know, when a letter was posted to him, where he would be standing when it arrived. What did Nora Rourke know, writing from a terraced house in Toxteth to a name and a shipping line, rather than a street and a number, that the poste restante counter in Liverpool could not know? And what did 5 months apart teach a Liverpool sailing family about a form of correspondence that no ordinary letter posted to a neighbour 2 doors down ever had to survive? Before Thomas Rourke's letters could be read, they had to survive a system built at 2 different scales at once: the fixed Crown Post Office on land and a sorting office that moved. On land, Liverpool's poste restante counter was one service inside a substantial Crown building, the Victoria Street Post Office. Opened in 1899 to replace an older General Post Office that had operated from the Custom House on Canning Place since the 1830s. A building of this size, with a frontage running more than 200 feet along 3 streets, existed because Liverpool's postal traffic by the turn of the century was not simply local. It was imperial and transatlantic traffic passing through a provincial address. At sea, the mail itself had its own sorting office, the Sea Post Office, a small working room built into transatlantic liners and staffed by trained Royal Mail sorters, who sorted the ship's outward and inward mail while the vessel was still underway, so that bags could be handed off the moment she docked rather than sorted afterwards. Liverpool had been the principal terminus for this transatlantic service through the early part of the century. In 1907, White Star transferred its main North Atlantic sailings from Liverpool to Southampton. Cunard followed by making Southampton the terminus of its New York service from 1919. The shift did not end Liverpool's importance, it redistributed it, and it marked the beginning of Southampton's rise as Britain's dominant passenger and mail port for the rest of the period this channel documents. What the system required of the men who ran it was precision under motion, sorting mail correctly on a rolling ship, in a room the size of a large cupboard, so that a letter posted in New York could be in a Liverpool or Southampton household within days of the ship's arrival rather than weeks. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail, between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the round, the sorting office, and the letter that the system carried. Not nostalgia for red vans and ocean liners. The documented operational reality of a postal system and the specific human meaning of what it delivered before the telephone changed what it meant to wait for news. What the Poste Restante clerk passed across the counter to a man 5 months off a voyage was never simply an envelope. It was the only fixed evidence, in his own hand, that home had gone on existing without him. And if you remember these letters, or wrote them, or waited for them, put it in the comments. If someone in your family sailed in the merchant navy, or you remember letters that arrived marked with a ship's name and a foreign postmark, tell us which line, which port, and what those letters meant to the person waiting for them. Next on this channel, Mount Pleasant after midnight, the night shift that sorted Britain's Christmas post before the streets outside were awake. Back on the round. What the Sea Post Office and the Crown Post Office could not do, between them, was tell a sailor's wife which port to write to next. A letter Thomas Rourke wrote from his lodging house in Toxteth to his ship's next port of call travelled through the ordinary domestic post, collected, sorted at Liverpool, carried onward through the standard Royal Mail network to wherever a shipping line's agent held mail for collection. A letter he wrote from Port Said travelled a different route entirely. And understanding that route is the difference between imagining the merchant sailor's correspondence as simple and understanding what it actually required of everyone involved. A letter posted in Port Said was first handled by the Egyptian Postal Service, under arrangements that varied across the period as postal administrations in ports along British trade routes changed. From there, it entered the international mail network through arrangements between postal administrations, sometimes carried onward by the next available British-flagged vessel, sometimes routed through a European hub before reaching London's international sorting office and re-entering the ordinary domestic system for final delivery to a Liverpool address. Nothing about this route was fast. Little about it was fully predictable. What made it work at all was that it was reliable in aggregate, even when it was unpredictable in any single case. The letter would arrive, eventually, by one path or another. Even if no one, not Thomas Rourke posting it, not Nora Rourke waiting for it, could have said in advance which path or when. This is the fact that separates the merchant sailor's correspondence from almost every other category this channel has documented. The wartime soldier's letter from France travelled a route governed by military postal arrangements with a knowable rhythm. The rural postie's round covered the same lane every morning. The merchant sailor's letter crossed an imperial and commercial postal network that had never been designed around any single family's need to know when the next letter would come. It had been designed to move commerce and administration. Personal correspondence rode inside a system built for something else, and it arrived on that system's schedule, not the family's. What did it mean for a household to organize its emotional life around a postal timetable that no one in the household controlled, understood in full, or could predict? And what happened when the ship itself, not the letter, changed course, before either half of the correspondence caught up with where the other one actually was? There was no single office responsible for explaining any of this to a waiting family. No clerk at the Liverpool counter could tell Nora Rourke whether her husband's ship had altered its schedule at Colombo, because the post office's responsibility ended the moment a letter was correctly forwarded along the documented route. What happened to the ship itself was shipping company business, not postal business. A family learned to live inside that gap between two separate systems, the postal and the maritime, each reliable in its own terms, and neither one obliged to keep the other informed on the family's behalf. The Crown Post Office was not the only place a sailor could collect his mail, and for many men, it was not the first choice. Near the docks in Liverpool, Southampton, Glasgow, Cardiff and Bristol stood the Seamen's Mission the Flying Angels Centre, run by the Mission to Seafarers, an organisation with roots going back to 1856, when it began as a Church of England ministry to sailors in the Bristol Channel. By the middle of the 20th century, it operated in more than 80 ports worldwide, and its centres offered something the official post office counter did not: a chaplain or welfare officer who knew the men by name, a warm room to sit in while sorting through weeks of correspondence, and crucially, an independent collection point for mail that did not require a man to present himself, still in his working clothes, at a formal government counter. For a sailor, between ships, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, the mission was where letters were held, where a reply could be written and posted without leaving the building, and where the chaplain's ordinary pastoral role extended, without much comment, into practical postal help. Reading a difficult hand for a man whose eyes were tired, explaining why a letter marked for one port had followed the ship to another, holding a man's mail if he had to sail again before he could collect it. This was not the post office's operation. It ran alongside it, independently, meeting a need the official system had not been built to meet. The sailor, who needed somewhere to belong to, however briefly, between the ship and the counter. What did it mean for a merchant sailor to have two separate institutions, one government, one charitable, each holding a piece of the correspondence he depended on? And what happened to the men whose ships turned around too quickly for either one to matter? The mission's welfare role had grown alongside, not instead of, its religious one. Its chaplains had originally been sent to preach and to distribute Bibles aboard vessels moored in harbour. By the interwar years, in ports across Britain and across the wider network, the mission maintained overseas the practical work of holding letters, running a canteen, and offering a bed for a night had become as central to what the Flying Angel Centre did as anything said from a pulpit. A sailor did not need to be a churchgoer to use the counter inside the door. Thomas Rourke's side of the correspondence was managed uncertainty, conducted from a moving position. Nora Rourke's side, conducted from a fixed address in Toxteth, required a different kind of skill entirely, and it is easy, looking at this only from the sailor's end, to miss how much sustained organizational work a merchant sailor's wife carried on shore. She did not write to an address. She wrote to a name and a shipping company, marked with her husband's ship, sent to the company's port agent, in whichever destination the sailing schedule suggested he might reach in time to collect it. This meant knowing, or finding out, which ports the ship was expected to call at, and in what order, information that came from her husband's last letter, from notice boards outside shipping offices, sometimes from other sailors' wives on the same street whose husbands served on the same line. It meant writing a letter, addressing it to a port the ship might not reach for 6 weeks, and having no way to know until a reply eventually came back whether the letter had ever found him. Documented accounts from maritime family communities in this period describe wives who kept copies, or at least notes, of what they had already told their husbands, not out of excessive care, but because letters crossed so unpredictably that a wife might otherwise repeat news twice, or a husband might reply to a question she had already answered in a letter still somewhere between Colombo and home. This was not occasional letter writing. It was a sustained, practiced use of a postal network built for commerce, repurposed by necessity into the emotional infrastructure of a household. What kind of knowledge did 5 years of managing this correspondence build in a woman like Nora Rourke that a household with a husband working locally never needed to acquire? And what happened to that knowledge practiced, specific, entirely uncelebrated, when the telephone eventually made it unnecessary? None of this appeared in any post office instruction manual, because none of it was the post office's system to document. It was knowledge that lived entirely on the domestic side of the correspondence built street by street, sailing family by sailing family, in terraces where half the households were managing some version of the same problem and had long since stopped explaining it to each other in full sentences. Before you can understand why a merchant sailor's letter carried a different weight than an ordinary domestic letter, you need to understand what the merchant navy's wartime losses meant for the families who depended on the post to tell them their men were still alive. Records of the First World War document approximately 14,661 British merchant seafarers killed out of roughly 7.76 million tons of shipping sunk by U-boats. In the Second World War, the losses were larger still. Around 32,000 merchant seafarers killed in convoy service out of a British merchant navy fleet that lost 54% of its 1,939 tonnage to enemy action. These were not abstract totals to the families of port city communities in Liverpool, Southampton, Glasgow, Cardiff, and Bristol. They were the reason a letter from a son or husband at sea carried a category of relief that a letter from someone working ashore never had to carry. A letter that arrived from Singapore or Sydney or Buenos Aires in wartime or in the years immediately after was not simply news. It was evidence dated, in the man's own hand, describing conditions specific enough that no one could have written it after the fact that the ship named on the envelope had not gone down, and that the man aboard it had been alive and well enough to sit down and write, at some point after the letter left port, closer to now than the family's last confirmed information. The gap between the ship sailed and the ship arrived safely was, for merchant shipping families, measured not in hours, but in weeks. And a letter was often the first proof that gap had closed favorably. This is what separates the maritime letter's emotional register from the ordinary domestic letter this channel has documented in urban and rural rounds. It was not simply awaited. It was, in the specific and literal sense, evidence of survival. What did the merchant sailor's wife of this period do with a letter that carried that particular weight? And what did she do in the days after the war, when she still could not entirely stop checking for it? Liverpool had dominated transatlantic correspondence through the early decades of this period. But from the 1930s, the balance shifted decisively towards Southampton. As passenger shipping expanded and the port's deep, 4-tide-a-day harbour made it the preferred terminus for the largest liners on the North Atlantic and the fixed mail routes to South Africa and beyond. A Union Castle Royal Mail ship left Southampton for Cape Town every Thursday at 4 in the afternoon on a rigid schedule, matched by a sister ship leaving Cape Town for Southampton at the same hour, a level of timetabled reliability that gave families on the Union Castle mail route something rare in maritime correspondence. A predictable rhythm to work the letter writing around. The other change of this decade was airmail. Available from the 1930s at a price premium, most ordinary sailing families weighed carefully against an ordinary sailor's wages. Airmail compressed a correspondence cycle that had run in months into one that could run in days for those able to pay it. It did not replace surface mail, the bulk of a sailor's ordinary correspondence still travelled by sea, in the hold or the sea post office of the next available vessel, but it offered, for urgent news, a genuinely new option. Not a letter that arrived eventually, but one that arrived soon. What airmail could not do was make the underlying uncertainty disappear. A faster letter was still a letter sent to a port the ship might have already left. The premium bought speed, not certainty, and a family weighing whether a piece of news was urgent enough to justify the extra cost was still making a judgment about a ship's position they could not verify. What did it mean to a Southampton family in 1938 to have, for the first time, a postal option fast enough to almost keep pace with a fast liner? And what kind of news did they decide was worth paying for? The choice itself became a small, recurring negotiation inside sailing households. An airmail stamp cost more than an ordinary one, and a family weighing whether a piece of news justified it was, in effect, pricing the news against the weight. A birth, an illness, a change of address. These were judged airmail worthy. The ordinary texture of a voyage, the food, the weather, the names of ports seen from a deck rail, could still afford to travel by sea. The decline of British merchant shipping from the 1960s onward and the expansion of ship-to-shore radio communication that accompanied it changed what maritime families depended on the post to do. Ship-to-shore radio telephone service, available at cost from the 1950s and more widely accessible through the 1970s, allowed a version of direct voice contact from mid-ocean that no letter, however fast, could offer. By the 1980s, satellite telephone links had begun to close the silence of the voyage almost entirely. What ship-to-shore contact gave a family like the Rorks was immediacy, a voice, confirmation in the same hour rather than across a gap of weeks. The ability to ask a second question and receive an answer before the ship had moved on to somewhere else. It did not give them anything to keep. A radio call left no object behind, no page in a woman's hand, no ink that had crossed an ocean in the hold of a specific named ship, nothing to fold back into an envelope and return to a drawer. Nora Rourke and the documented pattern of merchant sailors' wives she represents had kept every letter Thomas sent her across their years apart, not because she had been told to, but because a letter that had proved a man alive, once, seemed to deserve to go on existing after the news in it was old. The radio call did not ask to be kept. It was not designed to be. It did its job: confirmation, reassurance, a voice from somewhere across the world, and then it was over. complete in the moment it happened and gone the moment it ended. If someone in your family sailed in the merchant navy, or you remember letters that arrived marked with a ship's name and a foreign postmark, tell us in the comments which line, which port, and what those letters meant to the person waiting for them. If you have one of these letters kept in a drawer, folded along the same crease for 60 years, postmarked somewhere, neither of you had ever expected to have a connection, to put it in the comments and tell us where it came from. Next on this channel, Mount Pleasant After Midnight, the night shift that sorted Britain's Christmas post before the streets outside were awake. Thomas Rourke came ashore for the last time in 1961 after 22 years registered to sea. Nora had kept every letter he had sent her since 1934, Port Said, Colombo, Singapore, Cape Town, wartime convoy ports, whose names she had once been asked not to write down in a biscuit tin at the back of the sideboard. What the radio, telephone, and later the satellite call gave her, his voice, the same day, from wherever in the world he happened to be. What it never asked her to do, keep anything. The biscuit tin was still in the sideboard when she died. The radio call had not left anything behind to put in it.